I just wanted to pick up a new planner for the office. It was a normal Tuesday at the mall, the air smelling like cinnamon rolls and expensive perfume. I was still wearing my navy blazer from work, my hair tucked neatly into a bun, finally feeling like I had my life under control. Then I saw the reflection in the window of a boutique. The messy dark hair, the worn gray hoodie I used to wash every night. Lamar. He wasn't supposed to be within 3 miles of my apartment, let alone my favorite mall. My heart didn't just drop, it stopped. I tried to duck behind a decorative pillar, my hands shaking as I reached for my phone, but the shadow was already over me. Looking real professional, Brianna, his voice rasped, cutting through the mall's upbeat music like a serrated blade. Think you're too good for the neighborhood now? Think you can just block my number and become someone else? Lamar, please, I whispered, my back pressed against the cold stone of the pillar. I'm just here to shop. Just let me go. Before I could take another breath, he lunged. His hand gripped the front of my blazer, slamming me back against the pillar so hard the air left my lungs. People were walking by with shopping bags, laughing. A few slowed down, eyes wide with discomfort, but they kept moving. They didn't want to get involved in a domestic dispute. They just looked at their shoes or pulled out their phones. Then, his hand moved from my blazer to my throat. His grip was iron. I clawed at his light brown skin, my expressive eyes pleading with anyone, to help. I could see the rage in his eyes, but also that sick satisfaction he got from seeing me small. You're nothing without me, he hissed. You're just a girl from the block in a fancy suit. The world was starting to blur at the edges when I saw him. He was standing 20 feet away, leaning against a glass railing. A man in a tailored black luxury suit, looking like he belonged in a boardroom, not a brawl. He didn't look shocked. He didn't look scared. He was holding a subtle luxury watch in one hand and watching us with the cold, calculating patience of a predator. If you've ever been in a situation where everyone watched you drown and nobody jumped in, hit that like button and comment ready. Because what this man did next didn't just save my life, it redefined what power looks like. While Lamar was shouting, the man didn't yell. He didn't call for security. Instead, he moved with a terrifying, disciplined calm. He reached up to his neck, his lean, athletic frame shifting under the black dress shirt. He slowly, deliberately, began to loosen his dark necktie. It was a ritual. An executive preparing for a different kind of work. Lamar didn't even see him coming. 1 second, I was suffocating, the next, a hand with a faint tattoo on the side of it was gripping Lamar's wrist. You're making a scene, the man said. His voice was quiet, cultured, and carried the weight of a death sentence. Lamar tried to swing, but the man didn't even flinch. He just stepped into Lamar's space, his sharp jawline set, and in one fluid motion, he dismantled the man who had been my nightmare for 3 years. Lamar's face was a mask of twisted triumph, his fingers digging into my windpipe until the sounds of the mall became a dull roar in my ears. I saw the world starting to tilt, the fluorescent lights overhead blurring into long, jagged streaks of white. But then, the pressure shifted. A hand, steady and cool as ice, clamped onto Lamar's wrist. It wasn't a frantic grab or a desperate pull, it was a clinical, terrifying application of force. I saw Lamar's eyes bulge, not from rage this time, but from a sudden, sharp agony that drained the color from his face. The stranger didn't say a word. He just stood there, his dark tie hanging loose against his black dress shirt, his thumb pressing into a specific point on Lamar's forearm that made his entire hand go limp. I stumbled back, gasping, the air burning my throat like swallowed glass as I fell against the cold stone of the pillar. Lamar tried to swing his free fist, a desperate, clumsy haymaker fueled by pure ego, but the man in the suit moved like water. He didn't even flinch. He caught the punch in midair with a sickening smack, twisted Lamar's arm behind his back in one fluid motion, and forced him toward the floor. The stranger's gaze remained frozen, a cold, calculating stare that seemed to look right through Lamar as if he were an obstacle to be cleared rather than a man to be fought. You're making a scene, the man whispered. His voice was low, cultured, and vibrating with a lethal quiet that made the hair on my arms stand up. He didn't use a weapon, but as Lamar collapsed to his knees, whimpering and gasping in the middle of the crowded walkway, it was clear that the man in the tailored black suit was the most dangerous thing in the building. He held Lamar there for a heartbeat longer than necessary, a silent assertion of absolute dominance, before releasing him like a piece of trash. I was still shaking, my hand pressed to the burning bruise forming on my neck, when the stranger straightened his cuffs with a chilling indifference. He didn't wait for the mall security to arrive, and he didn't stick around for the police statement that I knew would go nowhere. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and pulled out a heavy, matte black card with nothing but a gold-embossed name and a number, Kang Tae-Jin. He dropped it onto my lap as I sat trembling on the floor, gave me a single, unreadable nod, and disappeared into the crowd before I could even find my voice to say thank you. That night, tucked safely behind my double-locked door, I pulled out my laptop, the screen's glow the only light in my dark apartment. My fingers hovered over the keys before I typed the name. The results were sparse but sent a cold shiver down my spine. There were no social media profiles, no LinkedIn bios, only grainy news clippings from international business journals and hushed forum threads that read like urban legends. The Kang Syndicate. The name was whispered in connection to high-end logistics, private security, and the kind of underground influence that kept the city's gears turning while the rest of us slept. He wasn't just a wealthy businessman, he was the head of a dynasty that operated in the gray spaces of the law. I looked at the card again, the gold lettering catching the light. It felt heavy in my hand, like a weight that could either anchor me or pull me under. I wasn't just saved by a passerby, I had been pulled from the grip of a street thug and placed directly under the gaze of a king. The realization was terrifying, but for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't thinking about Lamar. I was thinking about the man who loosened his tie and turned a monster into a whimpering ghost. The illusion of safety shattered 3 days later with a single, vibrating notification on my old phone. It was a text from my sister, the words blurring as I read them. "Bree, check the news. He's out." A clerical error regarding the filing of the restraining order and a sympathetic judge had been all it took. Lamar was back on the street within 72 hours, his rage likely simmered into something far more concentrated. I felt the familiar weight of the failed system crushing my chest. I was a dental assistant with a modest savings account, and Lamar was a man with nothing to lose and a twisted sense of ownership over my life. I walked into my apartment that evening, my keys trembling in my hand, ready to pack a bag and disappear into the night. I couldn't do this again. I couldn't live looking over my shoulder until he finally finished what he started at the mall. But as I pushed open my door, I stopped dead in the entryway. A neatly wrapped box sat on my kitchen island. It wasn't a threat, it was too precise, too elegant. Inside was a state-of-the-art smartphone and 4 compact, professional-grade security cameras, the kind used in high-end galleries. There was no note, no card, just the familiar matte black and gold embossed texture of the box itself. I realized then that while the law had turned its back on me, Kang Tae-Jin had not. He had seen the gaps in my life, the broken locks, the blind spots, the outdated tech, and he was filling them with a quiet, expensive efficiency. As I set up the cameras, watching the high-definition feed of my hallway on the new phone, the air in the apartment felt different. For the first time in years, the shadows outside my door didn't feel like they belonged to Lamar. They belonged to the man who was watching over me from a distance I couldn't yet measure. The system had failed me, but a ghost in a tailored suit had just stepped into the breach. The black sedan pulled up to the curb exactly as I stepped out of the dental clinic, its tinted windows reflecting the orange glow of the setting sun. The driver didn't say a word, he simply held the door open with a stiff, professional courtesy that made my pulse quicken. I knew where I was going. I had the matte black card tucked into my blazer pocket, a silent invitation I couldn't bring myself to decline. The car took me to a private room in a high-rise restaurant that overlooked the entire city, the grid of lights below looking like a circuit board. Tae-Jin was already there, his suit jacket discarded over a chair. He had rolled up his sleeves, revealing the lean, corded muscle of his forearms as he swirled a glass of dark liquid. The atmosphere was thick with a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but heavy, like the air before a storm. The dinner was served by staff who moved like ghosts, vanishing before I could even thank them. For a long time, the only sound was the clink of silver against porcelain. I watched him across the table, his sharp jawline set in that same calm, controlled expression I'd seen at the mall. "Why help me?" I finally asked, my voice barely a whisper against the vastness of the room. "You don't even know me." Tae-Jin set his glass down, his narrow, observant eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "I grew up in a world where the loud and the weak try to crush the quiet and the strong," he said, his voice smooth like aged whiskey and twice as potent. "Lamar is a dog who thinks he's a wolf because he's never met a real predator. He only understands the language of pain, Brianna. You've spent years trying to speak to him in the language of logic, of restraining orders, of mercy. It's a waste of breath." He leaned forward slightly, the light catching the minimal tattoo on the side of his neck. "Some people don't want to be better. They just want to be the one holding the leash. I don't believe in the system's rehabilitation. I believe in boundaries. And Lamar has crossed mine by touching what I chose to protect." "I'm not yours to protect," I argued, though my heart wasn't in it. "In this city, you are whatever I decide you are," he replied simply, without a hint of arrogance. "I don't offer charity, Brianna. I offer a world where you never have to look over your shoulder again. But you have to understand, once you step into my shadow, the sun looks different. You don't get to go back to being the girl who hides in the mall." He reached across the table, not to touch me, but to slide a heavy folder toward me. It contained everything: Lamar's debts, his associates, the bars he frequented. It was a map of a man's destruction. "Eat your dinner," he said, picking up his fork. "Tomorrow, the lesson begins." Lamar didn't take the hint. He showed up at the clinic the following afternoon, lingering by the glass doors with two of his associates, men who smelled of cheap gin and bad intentions. They leaned against a beat-up sedan, catcalling patients and staring through the windows with a predatory entitlement. Every time the bell above the clinic door chimed, my heart hammered against my ribs. They were there to remind me that the mall was just the beginning, and that no matter where I went, the neighborhood would always find me. I reached for the office phone, my fingers hovering over the keypad to call the police, but I stopped when I saw a familiar black SUV pull into the parking lot. Then another. They didn't park, they simply glided into positions that pinned Lamar's car in, cutting off his only exit. 4 men stepped out. They weren't wearing hoodies or worn jeans. They wore identical dark suits, their silhouettes sharp and disciplined against the afternoon sun. They didn't shout. They didn't draw weapons. They simply moved into a semicircle around Lamar and his friends, their presence turning the humid parking lot into a meat locker. The leader of the group, a man with a faint scar running through his eyebrow, stepped toward Lamar. He didn't square up to fight. He simply leaned in close, as if sharing a secret between old friends, and whispered something into Lamar's ear. I watched through the safety of the clinic glass as the bravado drained from Lamar's face. The man who had been shouting at me just minutes ago suddenly looked very small. His associates, sensing a level of violence they weren't equipped to handle, scrambled into the car, barely waiting for Lamar to stumble into the passenger seat before they drove over the curb just to get away from the silent men in suits. Tae-Jin's executives didn't chase them. They stayed for 10 minutes, standing like statues in front of the entrance, ensuring I finished my shift in total, absolute peace. It was a warning shot, a silent, terrifying display of what happened when you tried to touch something that had been claimed by the Kang Syndicate. As I walked to my car later that evening, escorted by a man who kept his hands folded neatly in front of him, I realized that the language of pain Tae-Jin spoke of wasn't always about the blow itself. Sometimes, it was about the terrifying promise of what came next. That evening, Tae-Jin came to my apartment himself. He didn't arrive with a fleet of SUVs or a team of executives. He came alone, knocking softly on the door I had finally stopped barricading with a chair. He was dressed down in a simple black t-shirt, the fabric stretching over his lean, athletic frame. As he stepped onto my balcony to look out at the city, the moonlight caught the skin of his arms, and for the first time, I saw the full extent of the ink he usually kept hidden beneath tailored layers. Intricate, traditional tattoos flowed from the base of his neck, coiling down his shoulders and wrapping around his forearms like a map of a forgotten world. They weren't the messy, impulsive marks of a street fighter, they were works of art, detailed and dark. They aren't just for show, he said, not turning around, as if he could feel my gaze on his back. In my world, you wear your history on your skin so you never forget where the scars came from. He began to talk, his voice a low, rhythmic cadence that pulled me into the past. He spoke of the slums of Seoul, of a childhood where hunger was a constant companion and violence was the only currency that mattered. He told me about the brotherhood he had forged in the dirt, a group of orphans who had nothing but each other. They hadn't started a syndicate for power, they had built it for survival, creating a family in a world that had discarded them. I wasn't born a boss, Brianna, he admitted, finally turning to face me. The intensity in his narrow eyes was softened by a flicker of something that looked dangerously like vulnerability. I was born a target. I spent the first 20 years of my life bleeding for men who thought they owned me. I learned the hard way that the only way to stop a monster is to become something they fear even more. I had to build a fortress so high that no one could ever reach over the walls to take what was mine again. He looked at me then, his gaze sweeping over my face as if searching for a reflection of his own fire. I see that same look in your eyes. You've been trying to douse your flame to stay safe, to fit into the boxes the world built for you. But the world doesn't reward the quiet. It devours them. In that moment, the gap between the dental assistant and the Mafia boss narrowed. He wasn't just a dangerous man who had saved me in a mall, he was a survivor who had turned his trauma into a throne. He was offering me more than just a security system or a driver. He was offering me the blueprint for a life where I was no longer the prey. You don't have to be a victim of your past, he whispered, stepping closer until I could smell the sandalwood and the cold night air on his skin. You just have to decide when you're done running. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday, the kind of night where the city feels muffled and the shadows stretch longer than usual. I saw it on the high-definition monitor first, a glitch in the darkness. Lamar, fueled by a dangerous cocktail of desperation and a bruised ego, had bypassed the front gate and was climbing the fire escape. He had a crowbar gripped in his hand and a wild, drug-fueled look in his eyes that I knew all too well. He thought he was catching me off guard. He thought he was finally going to reclaim the property he felt he had lost. I watched him on the feed as he reached the balcony, his silhouette jagged against the city lights. With a sudden, violent shove, he smashed the glass of the door, the sound shattering the quiet of my living room. He stepped inside, dripping water onto my rug, the crowbar swinging at his side. Brianna, he screamed, his voice cracking with a terrifying mix of rage and triumph. You think that suit and tie bitch can save you? You think you can just replace me? He didn't realize that the dead silence in the apartment wasn't because I was hiding under the bed or trembling in the closet. It was because he had walked into a slaughterhouse. Before he could reach the hallway, the lights flickered and died. Lamar froze, the crowbar raised, his chest heaving. Then, the kitchen light hummed to life, casting a long, sharp shadow across the floor. Tae-Jin was sitting there at the island, perfectly still, his black dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar and his sleeves rolled up. He didn't look angry, he looked bored, as if Lamar were nothing more than a late-night chore he had finally gotten around to finishing. You're late, Tae-Jin said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that seemed to fill the room. Lamar let out a guttural yell and lunged, swinging the crowbar with everything he had. But Tae-Jin didn't move until the very last second. He was a blur of black fabric and disciplined violence. He stepped inside the arc of the swing, his palm striking Lamar's chest with enough force to crack bone, while his other hand twisted the crowbar out of Lamar's grip like it was a toy. In one fluid motion, Tae-Jin drove him into the floor, pinning him there with a knee to the spine. Lamar's face was pressed into the rug, his frantic breath fogging the floor. Tae-Jin leaned down, his lips inches from Lamar's ear. I told you once, he whispered, that she is no longer yours to touch. Now, I'm going to make sure you never have the ability to touch anything again. Lamar's eyes went wide, reflecting a realization that came far too late. He hadn't broken into a woman's apartment, he had broken into a predator's cage. I stood in the doorway, watching the man who had once been my nightmare wither under the shadow of the man who was now my guardian. The fear that had lived in my bones for 3 years didn't just leave, it evaporated. Tae-Jin looked up at me, his expression unreadable, waiting for my signal. I didn't look away. I didn't ask for mercy. I simply nodded, and the room went dark once more. Lamar Hayes was never seen again. There were no sirens that night, no yellow tape draped across my doorway, and no frantic headlines in the morning paper. He simply ceased to exist in the fabric of the city. It was as if a giant hand had reached down and erased every trace of the man who had haunted my dreams for 3 years. The neighborhood stopped whispering his name, and the fear that had once lived in the marrow of my bones was replaced by a heavy, profound silence. A week after the night at the apartment, a different car came for me. It wasn't the sedan from our first meal, but a sleek, armored SUV that hummed with quiet power. The driver took me to the heart of the financial district, pulling up in front of a glass and steel monolith that seemed to touch the clouds. Tae-Jin was waiting for me on the top floor. The office was vast, filled with the scent of expensive leather and the hum of high-level commerce. He stood by the window, his tailored suit jacket back on, his tie perfectly knotted once more. He looked every bit the executive, yet the air around him still vibrated with that same disciplined lethality I'd seen in the dark of my kitchen. The dental clinic was a cage, Brianna, he said, turning to face me. He didn't waste time with small talk. He held a set of keys and a leather-bound contract in his hand. You're organized, resilient, and you have a stomach for pressure that most men in this building could only dream of. I need someone I can trust to oversee my legitimate holdings, the real estate development, the international shipping, the parts of my world that keep the lights on. I looked at the keys, then at the man who had dismantled my nightmare with a whisper and a strike. This wasn't just a job offer. It was an invitation to a different kind of life, one where I was no longer the girl scraping by on a receptionist's salary, waiting for the next blow to fall. It's a high-level position, he added, his narrow eyes searching mine. It's power. Real power. The kind that ensures no one like Lamar ever even thinks about looking at you again. But once you sign, you aren't just a survivor anymore. You're part of the Kang syndicate. I realized then that I didn't want my old life back. I didn't want the safety of a system that had let an abuser walk free on a technicality. I wanted the security of the man who stood beside me, and more importantly, I wanted the strength he saw in me. I took the pen from his hand, my fingers steady as I signed my name. I wasn't running anymore. I was moving up. Standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new office, I adjusted the sleeves of my tailored charcoal suit. The fabric was sharp, expensive, and felt like armor. Below, the city was a grid of moving lights and scurrying people, all living in the normal world I had finally left behind. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that had once clawed desperately at Lamar's grip in a mall food court. They weren't shaking anymore. They were steady, resting on a desk carved from dark, solid oak. I felt a presence behind me before I heard it, the familiar, grounding scent of sandalwood and the subtle rustle of a luxury suit. Tae-Jin didn't say anything at first. He simply stood a few feet back, allowing me to take in the view of the empire he had built and the section of it he had just handed to me. I wasn't just Brianna Jackson, the survivor, anymore. I was an executive of the Kang syndicate, the woman who handled the silent, legitimate machinery that kept the city running. The board is waiting, he said, his voice a low, smooth cadence that no longer sparked fear, only a deep sense of belonging. But they can wait 5 minutes longer if you aren't finished looking at the world you own. I turned to face him. He had his jacket off, his black dress shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the ink on his forearms, the marks of the brotherhood that now considered me one of their own. I realized then that my life hadn't just been saved, it had been transformed. When I walked through the lobby now, the security team didn't just nod, they stood at attention. When I entered a room, the air changed. The whispers didn't come from pity, but from a calculated, respectful distance. I wasn't just safe, I was untouchable. Tae-Jin stepped closer, his narrow eyes searching mine with that familiar, predatory glint, the one that had once terrified me but now felt like home. He reached out, his thumb grazing the side of my jaw where the bruises had long since faded. "You aren't the girl from the mall anymore, Brianna," he whispered. "You're the storm that comes after." I reached up, placing my hand over his. The minimal tattoos on his hand felt warm against my skin. I thought about the system that had failed me, the crowded mall that had watched me choke, and the man who had loosened his tie to show me what true power looked like. I didn't want the sun anymore. I wanted the shadow. "I'm ready," I said, my voice as firm and lethal as his own. As we walked out of the office together, the heavy glass doors swinging open as if by magic, I didn't look back. I had been grabbed by the throat by a man who wanted to break me, but I had been crowned by a man who taught me how to rule. I wasn't running from the monsters anymore. I was the one they had to worry about.